The air in the church was heavy, dense with the scent of white lilies and the unspoken expectation of 300 guests. I, Helena, stood at the center of it all, a beacon of lace and dreams, waiting for Lucas. But the clock on the sacristy wall moved with deliberate cruelty, and each tick-tock was a blow to my chest. The music stopped. The murmur of voices turned into whispers. The altar ahead of me remained empty. Humiliation is a cold feeling that begins in the pit of the stomach and slowly spreads, freezing every limb. I saw the look of pity on my mother's face, the confusion in my father's eyes. The dream, meticulously planned for over a year, was collapsing in real time, and I was the sole protagonist on this tragic stage. He would not come. The certainty of that was as solid as the cold marble beneath my feet. Instead of the groom, it was his younger brother Pedro who approached, his face pale and his eyes avoiding mine. He handed me an envelope. It wasn't a love letter, it wasn't an explanation. It was only 12 words hastily written on a paper napkin. "I'm sorry, Helena, I can't. Forget I ever existed." It was demolition in phrase form, precise and utterly devastating. The story everyone would tell would be simple. He left me standing at the altar, but for me, it was an unfathomable mystery. Lucas loved me. I felt it in the way he held my hand, the way his gaze found mine across a crowded room. There were no signs, no fights, nothing to hint at that. Abyss, the man who promised eternity, had vanished without leaving a trace, only an echo of silence. I walked out of the church through the back, my wedding dress dragging in the dust of the parking lot. The afternoon sun seemed to mock the darkness that settled inside me. This wasn't the end of a relationship, it was the collapse of a reality. I didn't know it then, but that moment of absolute abandonment was, in fact, the beginning of a journey that would take me to places far darker than an empty altar. The days that followed were a blur of unanswered phone calls and messages met with silence. The honeymoon suite in Paris was cancelled, and the partial refund felt like destiny's handout. My home, once a sanctuary of future plans, turned into a mausoleum of memories. Every object of his, a toothbrush, an unfinished book, an abandoned shirt, became a dagger embedded in the open wound of my pride. Lucas's family closed off in a complicit and impenetrable silence. His parents ignored my calls, and Pedro, after delivering the fatal note, seemed to evaporate. I was utterly isolated, trapped on an island of pain, while the world around me carried on. Friends offered words of comfort that sounded hollow, because no one could answer the one question that mattered: why he had vanished from the face of the earth. My initial state was not one of strength, but of utter devastation. I spent weeks on the couch, reliving every conversation, every kiss, searching for the flaw, the hint I had overlooked. Guilt began to settle in, a cruel companion whispering that maybe the problem was me. Maybe I wasn't enough to be loved, and that truth nearly destroyed me more than the humiliation itself. It was during the painful process of boxing up his things, of trying to erase his existence from mine, that I found something odd. Inside an old map book he barely touched, there was a yellowed business card. Silver Hook Bookstore, it read, with an address in a remote, rainy town in the south of the country, some place I'd never heard of. Lucas was not an avid reader. That small piece of paper became an obsession. It was the only piece that didn't fit the puzzle of the man I thought I knew. It made absolutely no sense. Why would he keep a card from a bookstore more than 1,000 miles away? Driven by a desperation that surpassed logic, I made a decision that would change everything. I needed answers, and perhaps, just perhaps, they were hidden among the dusty shelves of that place. With the money for our dream trip, I bought a bus ticket to the small, forgotten town of Brumas. The journey lasted 26 hours, time enough to doubt my sanity 1,000 times over. What did I expect to find? A confession? A ghost? It was a blind search, an act of faith in the midst of chaos, the real catalyst of my transformation, even though I didn't know it yet. Brumas lived up to its name. A persistent thin fog, hung over the cobblestone streets and the dark wooden houses. The Silver Hook bookstore was exactly as I imagined, old, with a little bell that chimed softly when the door opened, and a smell of paper and time that felt like balm for the soul. Behind the counter, a white-haired gentleman with glasses perched on the tip of his nose watched me with kind eyes. I decided not to reveal my identity or purpose. I said I was a traveler looking for a quiet place to spend time. The gentleman, who introduced himself as Arthur, offered me tea and a tired smile. I began visiting the bookstore every day, at first as a customer, then as a volunteer helper, organizing shelves and cleaning book covers that hadn't seen light in decades. That process became a form of therapy. The manual, repetitive work stopped me from thinking. The stillness of the place was a balm for my noisy mind. I was rebuilding myself in silence, book by book, shelf by shelf. The search for Lucas was gradually replaced by a search for myself, for a piece I didn't know I had lost long before the wedding crumbled. After 2 weeks of quiet coexistence, I gathered courage. With trembling hands, I showed Arthur a photo of Lucas and me, smiling on a happier day. I asked if he had ever seen him around. The kindness in Arthur's face dissolved, replaced by a shadow of sadness and recognition. He sighed, removed his glasses, and looked at me. "Yes, my dear, I know this young man. His story in this town is much older and more complicated than you can imagine." Arthur led me to the back of the shop, a small office cluttered with books and teacups. He began to speak, and the words that came out painted a portrait of a Lucas I never knew. He wasn't the successful engineer from a stable family that I believed. His family, in fact, had deep and dark roots in that small town, roots he desperately tried to cut when he moved to the capital. The story he told was about a debt, not a financial debt, but an honor debt left by his grandfather to one of the region's most powerful and dangerous families. Lucas grew up in the shadow of that broken promise, and his departure from the town years earlier was a flight, a desperate attempt to build a new life, far from that toxic past that haunted him. He believed he had succeeded. The wedding, however, changed everything. The news of our union, that he was finally laying down his own roots, traveled back to Brumas. The family to whom his grandfather owed loyalty saw it as a final affront. In the week of our wedding, they found him, not with physical violence, but with a much more surgical and cruel threat. If he married, they would come after me. The process of understanding that truth was brutally realistic. There was no epiphany moment, but a slow and corrosive pain. The image of the man I loved shattered into two, the groom who promised me the world and the fugitive who carried an impossible burden. The cold note, the silent escape, it was all an act of protection. He chose to be the villain in my story, so I could have a chance to live one. He left me at the altar, not for lack of love, but for too much of it. He sacrificed his reputation, his future, and the woman he loved to keep me safe. That abandonment, the greatest pain of my life, was in fact his greatest act of courage. And now, with that truth in hand, I had a new question to answer. What would I do with it? The hatred that drove me to Brumas had transformed into a complex and painful compassion. Arthur told me that Lucas wasn't far away. He had given up his career and was working in a sawmill in the neighboring town, doing anonymous manual labor and sending nearly all his wages to pay off the family debt. He was erasing himself from the world, punishing himself in self-imposed exile. The information hit me like an anvil. The anger gave way to deep sadness for the man he had become. I rented a car and drove the winding, wet mountain roads. With every kilometer, the internal debate intensified. Part of me wanted to yell at him for not trusting me, for making such a drastic decision alone. Another part only wanted to hug him and say we could have faced it together. What remained of the abandoned bride was a tangle of contradictory emotions. I found him at the end of his shift, covered in sawdust, his face thin and his beard unshaven, the fatigue in his eyes unmistakable. When he saw me standing by my car, the surprise on his face was swiftly replaced by panic and then by devastating resignation. He didn't run or hide. He stood still, as if waiting for the final blow he believed he deserved. The conversation we had was not a movie reunion. It was real, hard, and full of long silences. He told me the details of the threat, the paralyzing fear of imagining me in danger because of him. He cried, not out of self-pity, but out of relief for finally being able to share the burden. I listened, absorbing the magnitude of his sacrifice and of his lie. That meeting was not about reigniting a flame. It was about finding a closure. If you have ever faced a truth that completely changed your perception of someone, comment how you dealt with it. Your experience might be the light someone else needs to navigate their own darkness. The truth is that forgiveness is seldom simple. It doesn't erase the past, but it can redefine the future. And there on that dirt road, I faced the hardest choice of my life. My decision was not the one he expected, and perhaps not even the one I expected myself. I told him I forgave him. The relief on his face was immense, but I continued. I told him I forgave him for leaving me, for lying, for underestimating me, but that I could not return to the life we had planned, that Helena, the dream bride, no longer existed. She died on that altar, and the woman in her place was different. The journey to Brumus wasn't about finding him, but about finding myself. In the quiet of the bookstore, in the simplicity of the work, and in Arthur's companionable presence, I discovered a strength and independence I didn't know I possessed. My sustainable outcome could not depend on him or on resolving his past. It had to be mine. The applicable lesson for me was clear. My happiness was my responsibility, and I would not give it away again. I left him there with the promise that he must fix his life for himself, not for me. If he truly wanted to honor his sacrifice, he must free himself from that debt and become the man he always wanted to be, not the ghost hiding in the shadows. It was the most painful and yet the most liberating goodbye of my life. I returned to Brumus not as a broken-hearted woman, but as someone who finally held the reins of her own destiny. The following months were of quiet and deep transformation. Arthur, seeing the passion I developed for books and the place, decided to retire and offered me the chance to buy the bookstore. I used the remaining wedding money for the down payment. The Silver Hook bookstore became my refuge and my empire. I painted the walls, created a book club, and transformed it into a center for the small community. I was genuinely happy. A calm, solid happiness, built by my own hands. I no longer thought of Lucas every day. His memory had become a soft scar, a reminder of an old pain that propelled me toward the life I now loved. I had become the author of my own story, and the plot no longer included a prince charming to save me. 1 year passed. Life in Brumus had its own rhythm, marked by the seasons and the chiming of the bookstore. Doors bell. I became part of the town, knew the residents by name, their stories, their book requests. The woman who arrived there, broken and seeking revenge or answers, seemed a distant stranger, a character from a book I had read long ago. On a rainy autumn afternoon, the bookstore bell rang. I was crouched, sorting a stack of newly arrived books, saying, "Coming," without looking up. I heard footsteps, and when I finally rose, my heart stopped for a fraction of a second. It was him, Lucas. But not the defeated sawmill worker nor the smiling groom in my photographs. He was someone new. He was leaner, but his shoulders looked lighter. There was a calm in his eyes I had never seen. He said nothing, only placed on the counter an old leather-bound book. It was a first edition of one of my favorite authors, a rare collector's item. Inside was a receipt, not of a purchase, but of payment in full. His family's name was there, with the debt marked as fully paid. He explained that after our meeting, he realized hiding wasn't the answer. He sought out his family's creditors and renegotiated the debt, working day and night to pay it off once and for all. He sold everything he had, but regained his name and his freedom. He wasn't there to ask for a second chance for our past, but to formally introduce himself, the man he had finally become. That moment was the true conclusion of my journey. The story that began with the phrase, "He left me at the altar, but fate had other plans," finally made sense. Fate's plan was not to magically reunite us, but to break us so we could rebuild separately as complete individuals. What happened next wasn't a continuation, but a prologue to an entirely new story, if we chose to write it. We sat in the back of the shop, the same place where Arthur told me the truth, and had tea. We talked not like ex-lovers with a painful past, but like two strangers with a shared history. I told him about the bookstore, the peace I found in Brumus. He told me about the hard work, the humiliations he faced, and the satisfaction of finally freeing himself from his ancestors' burden. There was no kiss, no promises. What existed was a deep, mutual respect. He respected the strong woman I had become, and I respected the man who faced his demons and won. His transformation was as real and tangible as mine. He was no longer a fugitive, and I was no longer a victim. We were survivors, each in our own way, shaped by the same fire. He said he was just passing through, heading south for a new job, a new life. He simply wanted to thank me for forgiving him, and more importantly, for not taking him back that day. My refusal, he said, was what forced him to truly save himself, instead of hiding behind me. My strength inspired him to find his own. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Helena," he said, "if one day I return to Brumus, would you accept a coffee with a complete stranger?" I smiled, an honest smile, free of pain. "I'd love to," I replied. He walked away, and the shop fell silent again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of possibilities, like a blank page. The final lesson wasn't about love or forgiveness, but about authorship. We are all authors of our own lives. Sometimes the story takes a tragic and unexpected turn, but we always have the power to turn the page and begin a new chapter. My story didn't end with an empty altar. In fact, it was right there that it began. If this journey of overcoming and reconnection resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories that remind us of our own strength. And now, I ask you, what ending would you give Helena and Lucas? Leave your theories in the comments.